Hello everyone, my name is Ian McLaughlin and I have a PhD in neuroscience, and today I want to talk about consciousness. I guess I'm always technically talking about consciousness to, a degree, but today we're focusing on a certain aspect of consciousness, or maybe more specifically a certain experience that we can have, and more accurately a certain phenomenon of consciousness. More on that later. So we're going to talk about a study that explores the concept of pure awareness, or pure consciousness. And so this is a paper out of institutions in Switzerland and Germany, the University Hospital of Psychiatry in Zurich and the Johannes Gutenberg University in Germany. And one of the authors is actually one of the most prominent neurophilosophers alive today. And so that is Thomas Metzinger. So, and here's, what I think is a characteristically stern picture of him. So he's a prominent neurophilosopher, and he's written a bunch of books, maybe most notoriously on the topic of self, where he argues that there really is no such thing as the self. He definitely has some critics, mostly in neurophilosophy, as far as I can tell, but we'll leave those arguments for another day. Like the best neurophilosophers, from my perspective, though, pretty obviously I'm a little bit biased because I'm a scientist. He did a bit of actual research. And so this is definitely not the kind of research that I typically discuss, and quite different relative to the kinds of experiments that I conducted. Fundamentally, this is a survey, okay? It's an online survey presented in 5 languages: German, English, French, Spanish, and Italian, with 92 questions that people answered, right? And so what this survey focuses on is meditation, okay? Specifically the experience of pure awareness or pure consciousness that meditators can experience, though you can experience it without necessarily meditating. And so to begin, let's get a sense of what they mean by pure awareness. So one of the frustrating things about reading, the writing of many neurophilosophers is that it's really written in its own language. Like, just take a look at the title of this paper. What on earth is phenomenological? So don't worry, you don't really need to understand that. We'll define it in a little bit. It's not that big of a deal, but it can be a little frustrating. It's sort of like legalese, with its own kind of like sentence structures and lexicon. But anyways, pure consciousness or pure awareness is basically referring to a state of mind where a person is aware of being aware. When people sort of step back from the kind of base level of engaging in consciousness and become aware of their consciousness. And so there's a whole history to this kind of thing, and there are different ways to have the experience, maybe most commonly, or at least most soberly, through meditation, okay? However, due to this long history, there's quite a bit of cultural baggage to the concept. And so there's a fair bit of pseudoscience that surrounds the concept, and actually not a ton of really hardcore science to characterize and understand it. Nonetheless, it does appear to be a legitimate and genuine experience that we're capable of having, at least. And so what research has been done largely describes what it's like to have the experience of pure consciousness or awareness. So, for example, when people experience pure consciousness, there tends to be a loss of a sense of space and time, a loss of a sense of their body, or at least, a diminishing of our preoccupation with our bodies, a sense of contentedness and peacefulness, generally positive emotional states. But there hasn't really been a focus on what pure consciousness itself is like, where basically, which is where, this study comes in, right? This is what they're trying to do. Like, what is pure consciousness? Not what it's like to experience it. And so their work is the way they're doing this is based on the Minimal Phenomenal Experience Project, okay? Which is an effort that isn't strictly solely devoted to pure consciousness, but is rather focused on generating a kind of fundamental explanation of our conscious experience. And so they're trying to figure out what the simplest form of conscious experience is, along with a minimal model explanation, okay, for conscious experience. And so, at least in my mind, basically means they want to arrive at what we call a parsimonious explanation. That's like a term that's used in science. Basically an explanation of consciousness that doesn't make very many assumptions and really nails it as an explanation. It's totally coherent, understandable, it's not super complicated, it's parsimonious. And so, like when people used to ask me to define consciousness, that was one of the topics that got me to stutter a fair bit. Not because, I have no idea how to think about consciousness, right? I devoted over a decade to understanding at least one major part of consciousness. It's just one of those concepts that, the more you sort of scrutinize it and lift rocks and stuff, take a look around, the more complicated it gets. It's sort of like a fractal. And I typically respond to something probably irritatingly broad, like the awareness of one's own existence, both one's external reality and environment, as well as internal states, emotional states, hunger, pain, things like that, right? Okay, that's not technically wrong, but it's not necessarily very gratifying either. And I think we all know that, while that is technically correct, it's unsatisfying, right? It's sort of like defining love by saying it's when you care a lot about something. Like that's true, of course, but it clearly doesn't really reflect all the facets of such a complicated state of consciousness, love, right? It's just not satisfying, both to neuroscientists and people outside of the discipline. And so what they're pursuing with this project is an explanation of consciousness that's minimal, but also isn't sort of frustratingly brief and superficial, right? And I have a link to the website that explains their whole effort in greater detail below, in case you're interested in doing, just seeing some more of what they're doing. So this publication strikes me as really basically the first baby steps that they're taking towards assembling that explanation. And so what do they mean by phenomenology? Okay, so frankly, this is an example of the kind of thing that sort of turned me off of neurophilosophy, or at least, one of the things that convinced me that focusing on neuroscience was the path for me. It's a big, complicated term, and it can sort of mean different things a little bit within neurophilosophy. It can refer to what's basically a discipline within philosophy that started around the 20th century, started by people like Husserl, his student Heidegger, who's perhaps more well known, and then people like Sartre, right? And this all emerged in Germany, which is where Metzinger's from. So it can also, phenomenology can also refer to the way it's being used in this paper, right? Which is the effort to understand the structure of consciousness and experience. Everything from cognition and memory to creativity, imagination, emotion, desire. It's focused on the nature of reality as we experience it through our senses, okay? And it's sort of a counter-argument to the whole Cartesian approach to understanding consciousness, which makes very strict distinctions, right, between, the reality of the outside world and the reality as we experience it. And so, by the way, here's just another example of a kind of affectation almost in neurophilosophy that's just kind of a turnoff. So they use the term explanadum. Explanadum? Explanadum, really. Like, I don't know about you, but I've literally never heard that term used. And I went to grad school, like a really great neuroscience institution. Nobody used that term. And, and in case you don't know, explanadum is another word for explicandum. So pretty obvious, duh, explicandum. What? And so basically, explanans are things that do the explaining, while the explanadum is the thing that explains, or that the explanans are explaining. So super useful, right? Super intuitive. Maybe it's just me. I don't know. But I feel like we have plenty of words in our, vocabulary that can, suffice without having to invent completely inscrutable terminology to describe the process of explaining something. Anyways, neurophilosophy. So they're working on trying to figure out if it's possible for someone to simply be aware of being aware and nothing else. So, trying to identify the very specific minimal parts of the brain that are necessary for a conscious experience. That's their first goal, right? Their second goal, though, is maybe a little bit more approachable, though it is where they use that term explanadum. So the second goal is to try and figure out a way to explain consciousness in a way that's more intuitive, right? Like whenever someone asks me to explain consciousness, it's just such a gigantic topic that I basically had two choices, right? Either go with something that's, very complicated and involves touching on a whole bunch of networks, anatomical structures, networks of networks, and those interactions ultimately yielding consciousness, right? Or I could go with something less tangible, right? A less tangible explanation. And consciousness is the thing that fairly elaborate brains produce. And depending upon the structures that are present in the brain, you can have different types of consciousness, right? If you have the sensory organs of a dolphin or a bat, you're sensitive to sonar. If you have the photoreceptors of a mantis shrimp, you can see versions of colors that we can only imagine, by like using computers and stuff. The vast majority of us have 3 photoreceptors, which are basically sensitive to wavelengths of light that correspond to like red, blue, and green, right? RGB. And they combine to generate all the colors that we can see, right? Some of us, those of us who inherited 2 X chromosomes, can have 4 photoreceptors and are therefore able to even more precisely distinguish between the colors that most of us would see as exactly the same, right? Mostly somewhere, their ability to distinguish colors is mostly somewhere between red and green. And so, by the way, some studies suggest that 15% of women may have that interesting fourth photoreceptor, and some studies even suggest it may be even more common than that. But the point is, humans at a maximum have 4 color-sensitive photoreceptors. The mantis shrimp, they have 12. 8 of those 12 are sensitive to the types of colors we can see, right? Though, they could theoretically clearly distinguish between a whole variety of reds, right, that we'd see as precisely the same color, or at least that's what you'd think. There's evidence that they're actually worse than us at distinguishing between colors, despite their whole wealth of photoreceptors. It's more complicated than that. It's a complicated story. But, they also have 4 photoreceptors that are sensitive to ultraviolet wavelengths, right? So there's something very interesting and very different going on within their visual system relative to ours. And it's kind of a complicated story, from what scientists can currently, tell. But I bring them up because they have a different visual module, right, in their consciousness, simple as it may be. And so if you have the mantis shrimp visual module, your consciousness will be accordingly different, right? At least when it comes to vision. And obviously different kind of nervous system as well, but specifically when we're focusing on vision, it would be different. And so, if I'm trying to explain consciousness, not that, I certainly don't have the perfect explanation of consciousness, but if I'm trying to explain it, it's this long, laborious explanation that involves, trying to explain a whole bunch of anatomy, how it functions relative to how the neuroanatomies of different, right, animals' brains function, and then hopefully try to arrive at something gratifying and at least reasonably coherent, something that people can actually use. And so this group is aiming to generate an explanation that's far less convoluted than that, and that's far more concise than that. And so, they're trying to generate an explanation of consciousness that's what we would call parsimonious, right? An explanation that doesn't involve anything beyond just, specific neurophysiological factors that are involved in only those neurophysiological factors. And so this is no small challenge, right? And so, here's what they had in mind when they set out on this effort, on this journey. Maybe there's an explanation of your consciousness that doesn't involve things like your perception of the passage of time, your perception of your body in space, your personal autobiographical memory, not even your awareness that you have a unique identity, right? Not only that, but maybe there's an explanation of consciousness that doesn't involve any sensory input at all, right? Vision, hearing, touch, taste, and so on. That doesn't, concern itself with movement, that doesn't involve emotional experiences, and that doesn't even involve the constant sort of train of thoughts that just kind of bubble up and percolate into our conscious awareness. And so like a classic example of that is, if I ask you to not think about an elephant, right? It's basically impossible for you to not, at least for a moment, think about an elephant. Maybe even just the word, or maybe the image of a big elephant, right? It just happens to you. You have no control over it. So is there a version of consciousness that exists independently of that component? And so, if there is a version of consciousness that not only exists independently of that constant train of thoughts, as well as, a version of consciousness that exists independently of all those other things that I just listed, can we hone in on what parts of the brain are involved in generating it? Pure consciousness, in other words. So that's the fundamental goal of this group, okay? And let me tell you, it's about as lofty a goal as goals get in neuroscience and neurophilosophy. And to be completely clear, this is about as baby of a step as baby steps get, right? This is incredibly simple. It involves almost no actual neuroscience. However, I think this is a fun effort. And I think it's the kind of thing that helps to sort of plot a course for more hardcore neuroscience research, right? It's hard to find treasure without a treasure map, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's what they're trying to do. That's what they're working on. And here's how they did the work. So as I said, right, this is fundamentally a survey. It's a fairly expansive survey, though, this is where there are some meaningful concerns regarding just how reliable these data are. More on that later. Anyways, they specifically focused on meditation, right? And by the way, it's clear that this is the kind of work that became particularly appealing over the past year and a half, right? They collected their data between January and April of 2020. So, survey-based research was much easier to conduct remotely than basically any other kind of research. Much easier than it normally would have been during other eras, right? And so they had 3,267 responses in their survey. And again, the survey had 92 questionnaire items. And they initially, before sort of diving in, they asked people if they've ever experienced pure awareness, which, I have to acknowledge seems like a bit of a hurdle, right? Even as someone who spent the majority of a decade studying the brain, and at least in my humble opinion, studying a very important part of consciousness, sort of negative emotional states and negative affective states, I've never encountered the notion of pure awareness as like a formal phrase or category. But then again, they're not necessarily trying to get a sense of pure awareness in the general population, right? What they're trying to do is seek out people who might have actually experienced it, experienced this hypothetical state, and then get a sense of what it is that composes the state, right? And so, while my experimental design instincts sort of reflexes, kind of instantly reacted there, that they were sort of selecting for people that have experienced pure awareness, I don't actually think this is a problem for how narrowly this study is designed. So, they're not trying to understand pure awareness as it exists in the average human. They're trying to understand pure awareness itself, right? And the assumption is that only certain humans have ever experienced it at all. And so, whatever. I know that's a little persnickety, but that I figured I'd share as an example of one way that a study can be evaluated. And so, okay, when it came to people who responded the way I would have, right, which is, I have no idea what you mean by pure awareness, they were included, but they only responded to just purely demographic questions about basically who they are, if they have a religious affiliation, if they use any substances, and if they have any psychiatric diagnoses, how much they meditate, things like that, and how they meditate, what practice. Okay, so who composes this study? Let's see, is it this? Nope, there we go. Okay, so the average participant was 52 years old, and they had about half and half male and female responses, with a few more females than males. They present more info about the respondents than this, to be clear, like where the respondents were from, the vast majority of whom are from Germany, unsurprisingly, which we'll discuss a little bit later. But as you can see, right, they had folks who spoke a whole bunch of different languages. Here you go. The study participants, and you can see those are places that they're from. You can see the language that they speak up here. And so the study participants were from a pretty specific collection of nationalities, over half of whom from Germany, which again unsurprising. Anyways, once again, definitely not thoroughly confounding. Just worth keeping in mind as we interpret the findings in this study, right? It's not necessarily representative of like your average human. And so they also interestingly had a pretty wide range of meditation experience and meditation durations, ranging from 0 years of experience to 55 years. And some of the participants would meditate for just 1 minute a day, while others would do so for 240 minutes, 4 hours, which is, as someone who periodically does meditate, 4 hours, that's wild. And they're reporting that this is per session, right? So 4 hours of meditation per session. That's just bananas. So anyways, so they also collected info on what kind of meditation the participants practiced. And so you can see them here. And as a sort of dilettante of meditation, I wasn't surprised that Vipassana might be towards the top, one of the more common. It's sort of like the sort of super old school version of this whole category of meditation. And again, I'm no expert on this, but I know that the specific kind of meditation that I took classes in derived quite a bit from that early tradition of Vipassana. And we're talking like thousands of years ago, to be clear. And so I am a bit surprised that TM, which stands for Transcendental Meditation, was the least common. I thought that it was quite a bit more common than that. The whole TM thing is a whole different topic. It's complicated, and it's not all a positive story. And to be clear, the classes that I took in meditation would be in that MBSR category, which stands for mindfulness-based stress reduction. It's sort of like a very curated kind of school of meditation, I guess. It's also completely free, which is a bonus. And so as you can see, right, there's a whole variety of techniques represented, which is definitely pretty cool. And it's also interesting that so many different techniques arrive at what at least one arrive at least one shared sort of experience of consciousness, or pure awareness, pure consciousness, right? Kind of interesting. Despite different practices, they're all those roads are pointing in a similar direction. Kind of cool. So the group had their participants answer questions on a visual analog scale, okay, from 0 to 100. So what is an analog scale? You're very used to it. Basically imagine, the two ways that you could control the volume of your, whatever current speakers you're using, headphones or whatever. Most of us are using, either two buttons that basically move a little digital representation of a slider that can move incrementally between 0 and 100, right? That's an analog scale. You can sort of like, move a slider or turn a knob. And so now imagine instead of that system, you had just 10 buttons, and the volume is entirely determined by which button you press, right? You can press the 6th button, and that corresponds to a very specific volume. And you could press that 6th button 20 times, nothing changes, right? You're set to that specific volume, and you're staying there, no matter how many times you press the 6, right? So that's not an analog scale. Okay, so they were using an analog scale. And so these study participants were basically doing the equivalent of like sliding a volume slider, right, back and forth in response to certain questions about their experience of that, minimal phenomenal experience, right? That experience of pure awareness or pure consciousness. And here's some examples of the questions that they answered, which I know is probably pretty small, but you can see some of them at least. Like here are some examples. Okay, how alert were you? How awake were you? Right, those types of questions. And by the way, I really like that they asked this question, or these questions, like a pretty common experience, at least among the folks with whom I took my mindfulness meditation class. It was pretty common. People would begin to drift off into a sort of pseudo sleeping state, like a very, very light sleep, which by the way is like not the goal of this practice. Other examples of questions: was there a sense of self? Did you have mental images? Were you thinking about the future? Did you have thoughts? Right? Were you planning or thinking about the future? And so, and did you have spontaneously occurring memories? And so, there'd be like the most hardcore, for me, like that would be like the most hardcore yes on the right-hand side, right? Where, did you end up spontaneously having memories while you're meditating, or were you planning about the future? It was almost impossible for me to not do that. And that's part of why it is so difficult to learn mindfulness meditation. But anyway, so the way that they designed this slider is that they have like 100% yes on the right-hand side and a complete and absolute no on the left-hand side, and then they move a slider, from a default middle position towards, yes or no. And so, and they do acknowledge that this format wasn't necessarily optimal for every single question that they asked, particularly for questions that are, basically binary, like yes or no. Questions like, did you know that you would be able to deliberately think thoughts if you wanted to? Like either yes or no. Would it be a good description to say that your experience of pure awareness upon self-recognizing also recognized itself as that awareness which had always been present in all experiences in the past? Okay, that was like one of their questions. And I think it's fair to acknowledge that, at least for me, that last question is a bit convoluted. I'd have to like read through that a couple times. But, the answer to that question would ideally be yes or no. Okay, but that said, the nice thing about using an analog scale is it doesn't like force people into picking a 7 when they'd really want something just a bit over like 6.5, right? Okay, so let's get into what they found. So first of all, the vast majority of people who participated in this survey, reported having at least one bout of pure awareness in their experience. And generally speaking, people either spoke German or Spanish, as well as, and they also found that each additional 10 years of practicing meditation increased the likelihood that someone would respond by saying that they'd experienced pure awareness by between 2 and 5% each 10 years, right? And so that's a finding that sort of makes you go, huh. Another is that only 3.2% of their participants reported having no familiarity with the concept of pure awareness. And we'll get into one possible explanation of why that might be towards the end here, but when we get to some of the flaws of the study. But once again, as someone who's taken meditation classes, nothing beyond MBSR, right? No Vipassana, nothing like that. But I've taken classes, as well as someone who's not only a card-carrying brain nerd, but also, has been interested in questions like these for a very long time. I had no idea what the formal definition of pure awareness was, right? I could speculate, obviously, just based on the words, but yeah, I'd expect that this number would be higher than just 3.2% of people who are completely unfamiliar. Anyway, so it turned out that speaking German and practicing Mahamudra or Dzogchen, right, those forms of meditation, those were the best predictors of just already understanding what pure awareness meant, right? It wasn't a massive effect, but if you were those two things, you were much more you were more likely to be to understand or be familiar with pure awareness or pure consciousness. And so, okay, once again, I'm by no means am I an expert in these various meditation practices, but my understanding, having read about these distinctions between these various types of meditation, is that there are actually some meaningful differences between them, like specifically the ways you're instructed or guided. Like one of the classic early tools when you're learning mindfulness meditation is to focus entirely on your breath, right? As well as all of the sensations of breathing, right? So breathing is one of those interesting things that we do that can fall under the purview of both conscious and unconscious awareness. It can be purely automatic, right? Running in the background without you even thinking about it. But the moment I call your attention to, how you're breathing, like how long are you breathing in? How long are you breathing out, right? The moment I call your attention to all those things, all of a sudden you're like consciously thinking about breathing, and then you're consciously controlling your breath, right? It's kind of weird when you think about it. Very few aspects of our biology work that way, right? Particularly fundamentally critical aspects of our biology. It's not like if I were to ask you how many times your heart will beat in the next 15 seconds, you'd all of a sudden be able to like intentionally determine how your heart is beating, right? And same goes for like how much testosterone or estrogen you're releasing, right? Or your appetite, or how sweaty your sweat glands are getting, right? Those things just happen to you. Breath is different. And so as a result, some mindfulness meditation instructors will start by directing your attention to your breath, right? As well as things like, what it feels like as the air molecules move across the skin of your nose when you breathe in, right? Into your nasal cavity and then down into your lungs, and what it feels like as your chest expands, right? And then direct your attention to what it feels like as you're breathing out. Okay, it's a lot to sort of think about. It really occupies your mind, particularly for someone who had to take a bunch of anatomy classes, right, like I did. But anyways, it's just one example of one of the tools, one of the ways that mindfulness meditation instructors can begin to help you kind of, restrain and harness your cognition rather than let it just continue to completely run wild, unbridled. And so my understanding of Dzogchen is that they don't really use those kinds of training devices. And it seems like it might be a bit more difficult to learn, particularly from scratch. Again, I'm not an expert in that by any means, but at least for me, that's a pretty foundational difference. It's interesting that Dzogchen was the practice that was most regularly associated with a familiarity and experience of pure awareness. Okay, so now let's get to the real crux of the study. I know another small figure, but just stick with me. So after combining all of the answers, all those 92 answers from all those thousands of people, right, they found that certain types of awareness were most closely associated with pure awareness. And you can see this here. Now, why it is that they decided to label their various factors in the way that they did with like underscores and stuff, like why on earth did they think it's useful for us to see MPE70 underscore at underscore ease rather than something like at ease question 70? Like, I'd be willing to bet that it's because whomever did their data analysis is a bit of a code nerd and data scientist or something, and sort of wants us all to know that. But anyways, despite the intentionally convoluted y-axis, you can sort of get a sense of what's going on here. Okay, and so if you look towards the top of the graph, you're seeing the features of the experience of pure awareness that were super clearly associated with it, right? So being at ease, being at peace, being present in the moment, feeling relaxed, and so on, right? Those things were highly, highly associated with pure awareness. And then towards the bottom, you can see the experiences that were the least associated with it, right? Being in a dream state, feeling pain, planning for the future, contemplating one's desires, being aware of time, right? And so they scrutinize all this data, right? They interrogate those survey responses and come to 12 specific features of this state, right? 12 factors. As Metzinger said, quote, this led us to identify 12 groups, which in turn allowed us to name 12 factors that characterize pure consciousness. According to this scheme, typical characteristics of pure consciousness seem to be, for example, the perception of silence, clarity, and an alert awareness without egoic self-consciousness. Time, effort, and desire, which can certainly transpire in parallel, are experienced somewhat less explicitly. End quote, right? He's talking about what they found about pure consciousness, pure awareness. And then he later says, quote, based on these 12 factors, we can now develop a prototypical minimal model of human consciousness. All right, so some pretty big claims there, right? He's basically saying that through this survey, they've identified sort of 12 central minimal features of human consciousness. That's not only like a really big claim, that's like a huge claim. But, before we really, interrogate those data and this claim, let's just get into the 12 factors. Okay, so factor 1. Time, effort, and desire. And keep, remember, these are the sort of 12 central factors that explain or that are inherent to pure consciousness or pure awareness. So factor 1 is time, effort, and desire. So they describe this as being the experience of and the awareness of having specific goals, as well as what the body would need to do to achieve these goals, right? So in other words, having thoughts like, I want to be successful or something, would definitely fall under this category. But I suspect thoughts like, I want to be calm, would also fall under this category, right? Even things like I want to keep my back straight while I'm sitting down and meditating, right? Even things like that, I think being aware of all those things would fall under this category. That would disrupt one's ability to experience pure awareness, but then also would, jar somebody outside of it, right? To leave pure awareness. And so here's how the group describes this factor, their first factor. Quote, typically there will be an attentional lapse followed by the phenomenology of noticing, remembering the goal state and refocusing. So basically, what they're saying is that the meditative state, right, irrespective of which practice, can be broken by you, right? Or it can be broken by that sudden, thinking about something that you have to do in like 2 days or whatever, right? Or what you're going to do on a date that you have this coming weekend or something like that. It just sort of happens in your mind. You have no control over it. And so that's factor one, right? So factor two, peace, bliss, and silence, was negatively correlated with factor one, time, effort, and desire. So that sort of makes sense, right? I feel like that one's pretty intuitive. It's tough to be, at peace, experiencing bliss and silence when you're thinking about, the jokes you're going to tell your date this weekend, Okay, so, but then their factor 8, skipping ahead a little bit, don't worry, emptiness and non-egoic self-awareness was also negatively correlated with factor 1. So that's not particularly shocking, right? If you're not focused on your own ego and you're relaxed, you're probably, also not focusing on time, effort, or desire, right? So that makes sense. It's coherent. So I don't want to belabor each of these 12 factors, but, before we get down to business, I definitely see a lot of the kind of terminology that, at least for me, is sort of associated with kind of like loose, unfamiliar, maybe fluffy descriptions. Maybe it's just me, but at least some of it is a little bit beyond me. Maybe not exactly as appetizing as it could be, and that's maybe purely an aesthetic predisposition that I have. But anyways, okay. As we go through them, keep in mind that these all aren't positively associated with the experience of pure awareness, right? So in other words, like some of these factors are what people would experience when they're not experiencing pure awareness, according to what this group, collected. Okay, so factor 1, right? Time, effort, and desire. I think that's pretty intuitive. This is sort of like the natural state of affairs, right? When you're not meditating, you're focusing on what time of day it is, what we have to do, what we have to get done before we can relax, right? The work that we have to do, the things that we want in this moment, things like that, right? Factor 1. Factor 2, peace, bliss, and silence, right? I think this one is pretty intuitive as well. It's difficult to successfully meditate when you're feeling a whole bunch of rage, right? That said, I do think it's worth acknowledging that there are exclusively positive emotional states that are associated with pure awareness, right? So it's not free from some emotional characteristic whatsoever. It's just certain kinds. But anyways, okay. Factor 3 is self-knowledge, autonomous cognizance, and insight. And so I'll be honest, I don't really know what this is describing. They have some, other descriptions of this factor, factor 3, and perhaps that phrase means more to you than it does to me. But this one's a little bit over my head, I'll be honest. So factor 3, self-knowledge, autonomous cognizance, and insight. Okay. Factor 4. So, that could potentially be like your sense of self, right? Your awareness of your, identity. It could be that. Okay. Factor 4, wakeful presence. This one strikes me as a little contradictory in the context of some of the following factors that they describe. But I think fundamentally this is saying being awake, right? Not drifting off to sleep, which can be kind of easy to do when you're meditating, believe me. And so factor 5, pure awareness in dream and sleep. Okay, so this is one of the parts of the publication where I'm not sure if I'm on the same page or just projecting my own experiences, on their description. They say lucid, dreamless sleep. So, I've absolutely drifted, in stages of sleep where I'm absolutely not asleep, right? But I also couldn't possibly operate, heavy machinery, like drive a car or something, right? And in those states, I can make the decision to get out of bed. But I'm also sort of drifting, right? In a sort of less than aware state. Usually, to be honest, it's kind of a frustrating state that it's something sort of like diet sleep, right? It's sleep but deprived of all of its nutrition, that kind of thing. I'm in bed, I'm motionless, my thoughts are sort of drifting randomly, but I'm most definitely not asleep. But I can imagine that if I were meditating, this would probably be a gratifying and wonderful state of consciousness. I've never gotten there while meditating, clearly, but I think many of us might have experienced it in one way or another, when we're not exactly asleep, but also not super restless, All right, so that was factor 5. So factor 6, luminosity. Which refers to the experience of brightness, radiance, and vibrancy, as well as having closed-eye visual experiences of brightness. It's pretty self-explanatory, right? Luminosity in general. Okay, factor 7, thoughts and feelings. this is basically describing what, at least in my mind, is the most common intrusion when I was trying to figure out mindfulness meditation. So as they describe it, it's sort of like the collection of random things that pop into your mind that don't really involve any deep thought, right? Just sort of like random things that like pop into your mind when you're taking a shower or something, taking out the trash, doing the dishes. At least for me, this was the sort of primary obstacle when I was trying to at least come close to mindfulness. So that's factor 7. Okay, and remember, keep in mind, like, these can be positively associated with pure awareness, pure consciousness, or negatively, right? They can make it more difficult or easier. Okay, so factor 8, emptiness and non-egoic self-awareness, which is something that we touched on earlier, right? So this is difficult for me to articulate, I'll be honest. At least by my reading, it's difficult for the authors to articulate as well. But I suspect that at least part of what these participants are experiencing is just the complete absence of any concern or even awareness of their own personal priorities, their hopes, their desires, their concerns, or even their existence, right? There's a whole concept of ego death that is sort of described in certain circles of neuropharmacology, but that's a topic for another day. Just imagine that you have no concern about who you are, where you are, what you need, what you want, right? That can sort of just dissolve away. Anyway, so that's factor 8. Factor 9. Sensory perception in body and space. So basically focusing on what's going on with your body, right? This one's like the most unsurprising for me. I think it's why sensory deprivation tanks have become rather popular for actually, they've been popular for several decades, but particularly recently. They really help to sort of almost entirely mitigate the intrusion of your own sensory nervous system into something like pure awareness, right? And so, if you're noticing that it's cold, you're not experiencing pure awareness, right? If you're suddenly itchy, if you're feeling an ache in your knee or your back, right? If you're suddenly driven to crack your knuckles, right? Things like that would all work against your ability to experience pure awareness. And this was definitely one of the first hurdles that I encountered when doing that mindfulness class. It's too hot in this room, which is like basically always happening in my mind in any room I'm in that isn't, this room, basically. It's kind of frustrating. Anyways, factor 10, touching world and self. This one's a little abstract, but they're basically referring to when you might describe a lovely experience like cuddling as being warm, even if you're not actually warm. So just those sort of that collection of experience that you can have. Cuddling just feels warm, even if you're not under the covers, that kind of thing. Okay, factor 11, mental agency. This one's kind of tough. This is, I think, the sort of central moment that mindfulness is focused on achieving. So basically those moments when you're aware that you could begin thinking about a specific thing, right? And you either elect to go ahead and think about it or you don't. And when you're in a mindful state, you don't begin thinking about that thing, right? It's a pretty lackluster description, I know, but I'm pretty sure that's what they're describing. And it is sort of like the muscle you're trying to train with mindfulness meditation, to have some agency in what you're thinking about and what your brain is serving up to you. And so it's unsurprising to me that would be one of their factors. And then finally, factor 12, witness consciousness. I have to admit that at factor 12, these folks are having a conversation that's a bit over my head. And I suspect it's a kind of experience that's difficult to use words to describe, right? In a way that's like intelligible. Basically, I suspect they're describing the kind of thing that you have to experience, right? You can't really describe it sufficiently. You had to be there, right? That kind of a thing. Okay, so those are their 12 factors that describe pure consciousness. That is what it is, right? The sort of minimal features of pure consciousness or pure awareness. Okay, so, like every study, even when it comes to a simple study like this, just basically a survey, there are limitations that should be acknowledged. And so the main one is what I mentioned early on, how it is that they're recruiting their participants. So they started by sending their survey information to a group of people who were regular and committed practitioners of meditation. Okay, no big deal there, right? We already talked about that not necessarily being a problem for at least the purpose of this study. Well, the study says that Thomas Metzinger, right, the scientist, the neurophilosopher, Metzinger himself emailed the survey, right? So to like essentially people in his address book. And so, I'm sure I don't really have to belabor this point that this introduces a bit of a problem regarding who exactly composed the sample population in this study, right? These were presumably people who with whom Metzinger had either interacted or maybe shared some kind of meditation-related network, right? So it's not like an ideal recruitment strategy, or at least not, as much as I'd like, to be, I'm not part of Thomas Metzinger's meditation network. It would be really fun, I suspect, and very interesting, but I'm not. And, I imagine that you probably aren't either, So it's not like a massively confounding problem, but it's just not ideal, right? That's a very specific collection of people. So that said, those 12 factors are the specific things that all of these people who have experienced pure awareness all agree on being central to the experience, right? This is the features of their experiences that they all shared. Okay, and to be clear, like a lot of this isn't really super intuitive to me. Maybe it is to you, but I definitely struggle with understanding some of what they're describing, which leads me to believe that I've never experienced pure awareness. Could totally be the case. I have experienced mindfulness. It seems to me that mindfulness is just sort of like a subset of. It's a necessary but insufficient subset of pure consciousness, pure awareness. Yeah, like some of their descriptions of those factors were just sort of like, and then I was like translating what they were writing, right? They were writing in philosophy ease, and so I did my best to try and interpret what they were trying to describe, and almost certainly there might have been something lost in translation, but I think we get an overall concept of what they're trying to convey, right? Which is, what is pure consciousness? It's that minimal conscious experience that all you are conscious, and you're not thinking about anything else. You're not doing anything with your consciousness. It's just there, right? So I think it's really interesting. And on top of that, this is fundamentally just a survey, right? But it's also an early step towards understanding some of the most unusual and sublime experiences that we can have. And so, I find it to be an interesting effort, and I'm looking forward to seeing, when they're able to integrate a bit more neuroscience, a bit more hardcore science, to get a sense of what's actually going on in the brain during these periods of pure awareness, given the fact that they've identified quite a few people who have been aware, and many of them are in Germany, where Thomas Metzinger lives and works and teaches and professes. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what they do. There's a lot of really, really fabulous neuroscience institutions in Germany, and so it's an interesting strategy, and this is a great example of why it can be really, really productive to have, interdisciplinary approaches, particularly in questions in neuroscience, because it just brings a bunch of different tools to the table, and different, sort of like traditions, right, to the table. So, all of that said, if you're still here and you dig this kind of discussion, maybe you'll, consider subscribing and doing all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Hey, Scott, thanks for jumping in, man. Sorry, though, what is love? I only know pain. Doesn't the mantis shrimp also punch extremely fast? Yes, wildly fast. I've got a wild meditation story for you sometime. Yeah, it'd be interesting. Are you familiar with the notion of your consciousness moving from your head to a point below the navel, what the Chinese called danqian and Japanese called itian? I'm not familiar with the Japanese one. But yeah, I mean, I have. I believe we read about that in that class or that I took or something like that. But no, by no means am I an expert in that. Anyways, all right, yeah. So thanks for watching, everybody. Maybe you'll consider subscribing. Otherwise, I will see you next week.